And I'd like to introduce Bill Whitelaw, who's the SVP at Glacier Media, and is also the CEO of JWN, which is a major oil and gas news and analytics play based out of Calgary. So, Bill, please go ahead.
Thanks, Anthony, very much, and welcome back after lunch, folks. It's always sort of nice to be able to tell your families that you went to the Canadian Embassy and had sandwiches and chips as part of your workday. So we've got a great panel. So far today we've talked, we've got a great story about Quebec with Plan Nord and what's happening there. We've heard a very compelling story about BC and the relationship that BC industry, First Nations, and the government work collaboratively together. So if you're an investor, you're starting to get a sense of the rhythm of what we're trying to help you understand is how does your capital sleep at night, and why mining in Canadian investments in Canadian mining companies, whether they play in Canada or whether they play globally, is a good bet. Now, if I'm an investor, I also want to make sure that the companies that I'm putting my capital into have a good technology plan and a good innovation plan, and one that is leading edge but not necessarily bleeding edge. And so we've got a great panel today of three innovation and technology thought leaders who, over the next half hour to 35 minutes, what we're going to do is explore the range of dimensions in the Canadian mining industry, where it's doing, what it's doing, and where it's going in terms of the innovation space. Many of you last year would have seen a federal government program that asked a number of industry sectors across Canada to create superclusters of innovation, and there was a very good one that came out of the mining industry that unfortunately wasn't funded ultimately by the federal government, but is still pushing forward with some of the cool things that it's doing in the mining technology space. And so without any further ado, with our panel, we have Liam Fitzgerald on my far right, and Liam is a tax partner with PwC, but importantly, he's also the national mining lead. We do a lot of work with PwC across our energy and mining spaces, and they're a great company to collaborate with, great organization. In the middle is Georg Gradl, who runs the global mining and metals for SAP, and he's with us today from Germany. And then finally, we have Steve de Jong, who's here in a dual role as a technology startup company, but also a very experienced mining executive and currently chair of Integra Resources. And you'll know Integra because he was also chair of Integra Gold when it was sold to Eldorado a few years ago on a very nice sale. So what I'm going to get the panelists to do is reflect for 3 or 4 minutes on their take on the big things that are reshaping the industry. And this is just not all a software play. It's what's going on the mine site, what's going on in the development process, what's going on in everything from blockchain to machine intelligence. And then we'll dive into some questions, but we really want to make this interactive. So the questions that you as investors want to ask is, you've got three thought leaders who are sort of shaping the way we're going as an industry here. And so we're going to start with Liam, who sees things. PwC invests a lot in innovation and innovation thinking on behalf of its customer base, and was one of our sponsors of our Innovation Symposium in Toronto last year. So over to you, Liam.
Thank you. So when we look at data from an accounting firm perspective, we're always looking at it based on what do we do with the data. So every time I talk to mining companies now, it's never about obtaining data. What we usually find is they have mountains of data. All it is now is about managing data and processing data and using data. So probably the best example we've been collaborating with was Goldcorp with their IBM Watson initiative, looking at cognizant computing or artificial intelligence. So probably the biggest advancement we're seeing and what we're trying to assist with is looking at data, particularly on the exploration cycle. So you've got the most data in the cycle now is at exploration stage. You've got the sampling, you've got the core data, you've got the most data you can have in a limited amount of resources. So how can you use cognitive computing or artificial intelligence to take that data to reduce the amount of data you have to get the most success? So what we're looking at, for example, is how do you take a core sample, and instead of taking 100 drill holes with core samples, how do you take 2 drill holes and then try and extrapolate using the data to reduce the number of drill holes you do in sequence to see if you can actually get the same result with 10 drill holes instead of 100. So we're trying to look at how do we look at that cognitive computing, so I'm Australian so I can never get that bit out, to try and use the artificial intelligence. So the biggest example we have is Goldcorp right now with Red Lake, when they're using IBM, using Watson, to try and do iterative approaches with the data. So once you look at the data once, can you look at it twice, 3 times, learn as you go through the data to try and then get a predictive model. If we can then do a predictive model, you'll see less and less junior companies explaining how many drill meters they do. They get less assessed on the volume of data they get are more assessed than what they're doing with the data, the quality of the data. So we think that's probably the biggest thing that we've seen in the last 12 months.
Thank you very much, Liam. So obviously the data dynamic is out there, and George, as we segue to you in terms of what we see SAP looking at globally. And
well, obviously I would like to use a few words to introduce what is SAP doing in mining. Some company might know us. We are in a lucky situation that many of the top 100 miners are using us as a back-end ERP solution, as a transactional system, or as an analytics solution. But where are we in mining operations? And that's actually the viewpoint I would like to focus on today. Today's technology allows us to really connect the mine with the back-end ERP transactional systems. You have Internet of Things, you have drones who can monitor what's happening. You have technologies that haven't been around 10 years ago. But using that information and then link it to a transactional system and then trigger some action out of it, that's where the link actually becomes strong. That's our viewpoint on what we want to achieve in mine. I tried to use the term run your mine like a factory, because what you really need to achieve is to, first of all, have a mine plan that you execute against, which is also linked up to a financial plan, and then secondly, monitor if you're up to the plan, and if there's a deviation, make adjustments. And for that, you need a strong interaction between mine technical solutions and a back-end ERP. So with that, I will probably have a chance to get a bit deeper into that subject, but as an introduction of where we see technology being used, those are the things I would like to share.
Perfect. That's a great framework. And Steve is here, as I mentioned, in two capacities, and at the back of the room is a wonderful display of the Verify technology, and Steve will lead us through that in terms of how that particular approach is opening up the sort of boundaries of transparency and opportunity for mining companies as well. But he's also got takes on as a mining operator. So your framework for what you're seeing as the big moves now.
So I was fortunate at a young age in the industry to get exposure to the different parts of a mine. When I was 27, I became the CEO of a $10 million exploration company, and that was in 2012, and about 2 weeks later, the price of gold peaked at $1,900. I spent 5 years kind of with that company, and it was acquired for $600 million in July of 2017, and now it'll produce 50,000 ounces this year and 150,000 ounces next year, and so on. I got to see from exploration the entire way through into development, and now get to watch from afar in construction. One of the things we really tried to embrace at Integra Gold was innovation and technology. And right now it's a bit of a buzzword. Everyone's it's either machine learning or blockchain or artificial intelligence. I think that'll continue, and the way the industry works right now, blockchain's exciting, so everybody kind of attaches blockchain to what they do, and they get to watch their share prices double. I think what we need as an industry to actually truly be successful in innovating and embracing technologies, to create a bit of a framework and a system or a platform that allows for this. At Integra Gold, one of the things we did in 2014 was we did a crowdsourcing challenge. We made an acquisition, acquired a big database, but we just wanted the infrastructure. So this database of information, we had 12 drill rigs turning at the time. We didn't have time to look at it. So we did a $1 million crowdsourcing challenge. We tried to pay that with flow through. That didn't work. But what we saw 1,400 people from 90 countries give their ideas on what we should do with this data and how we could apply different technologies to it to make the next big gold discovery. The next year after that, kind of going on the back of this, we did something called Disrupt Mining with Goldcorp. And we co-hosted this event, and we had 150 submissions from all across the planet on what are different ideas that could disrupt mining. So I like to think sort of we started something, and we got to see it again. Obviously, Integra Gold's not around anymore, but we got to see it again this year at Disrupt Mining that Goldcorp put on, where we're starting to create a bit of a framework for innovation and disruption. And through that, I think there are a lot of good ideas out there already that exist that just need a platform to be able to present themselves. One of the finalists from Disrupt Mining, when we co-hosted with Integra Gold and Goldcorp, was that I ran into at the Goldcorp event this year. And I asked him sort of 12 months later, how has your life changed? Because he didn't win the competition. He was just up there on stage. And his idea was using bacteria, using biology instead of cyanide to leach gold. And he said from the moment he got up on that stage, his entire life changed. And he has had nonstop business from big companies who are starting to push this technology forward. And in the 5 years leading up to that, his technology hadn't really changed at all. It was because he was given a platform to do so. So I'm a big believer that kind of if we can find a way to create a framework for technology, for innovation, then we're going to see our industry make leaps and bounds from where we are today. And a lot of those ideas probably already exist. We just have to kind of create something that allows himself to show himself.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. So maybe if we can take exactly what the three of you just said and sort of put a value creation lens on that in terms of investors typically think about great management teams, good prospects, and that sort of thing. Should the investors of the future be thinking about a great technology position in for a mining company as they think about where they're going to place their capital? So we could sort of focus on what you guys think that mining companies should be articulating in terms of their technology and innovation solutions as a way of creating shareholder confidence.
Yeah, I think what we've been advocating for a while is that mining can't keep going back to the same investor group. So you not only have to look at technology on the basis of reducing costs, getting more efficient, and producing immediate shareholder value. What you have to look at is how do you have someone who's 15 right now who's glued to their iPhone invest in a mining company as soon as they actually make a paycheck when they're 23 or 25. Because you take, most of the kids I know barely know what a mining company is. Like my two twin 9-year-olds are a little embarrassed if they tell their friends I'm in the mining industry. They kind of just say, Dad's an accountant. So the problem we have is that how do you get, you'll need to use technology and to show that you're technologically savvy, not just to get the results in the company, but to attract the next investor. Because when you're competing with Apple, with Google, with Amazon, like I've seen, I went through a tour of an Amazon warehouse, and have these throwing robots where instead of people picking parcels up, they'll throw a parcel with accuracy over 100 meters, so it's caught at the other end and put on a conveyor belt. That's what they do. And the kids think that's cool. They don't have any trouble attracting investors. If you put your hat on a gold company, how does a gold company compete with that for a limited amount of capital? So technology from a value creation perspective is also trying to look at how do you frame yourself as a company to actually get invested into for the next generation. Because unfortunately for us, in 10 or 15 years, and if we're the only investors in mining, it'll be starved for capital.
George?
Well, in my viewpoint, the major driver for shareholder value of a mining organization is essentially two factors. The one is the life of mine and the value of their resources, reserves. And I think a mining company needs to balance those two factors out properly. What if I have a solution that can up-to-date tell you the value of the resources and reserves like an inventory management system, and then also shows you the depletion or any updates from new explorations or any updates from new test drills up to date? That gives you complete visibility into what the value is that sits in the mine. We are working with one partner, a mine technical system expert called MineRP, on exactly that concept. A second thing that I think can drive shareholder value is everybody has a proper mine plan in place, but everybody admits that they are struggling updating a mine plan on a shorter notice. It usually takes 4 or 5 months, most companies admit, to build a mine plan, which is then valid for the next 2 years, 3 years, and then you redo it again in yearly cycles. What if you can do a mine plan within a few days, do a few, let's say, simulations of different scenarios, and then pick the best? And whenever the market changes, gold price goes up unexpectedly, you adjust to a different version, because then you can start mining, let's say, lower grade assets that are still profitable under a high gold price, and the other way around. So those are the two main points I can think with solutions you can influence shareholder values.
So, perfect. Thank you, George. And Steve, you've been in that position of having to create that shareholder value. tell us your thoughts on how that technology helps influence that.
So I think I'll build a little bit on what Liam said, because I'm a big believer that, well, I agree that there's a lot of untapped capital out there for people who just find mining convoluted or just don't understand it. And whether we like it or not, the way people process information is going to continue to change via Snapchat, Instagram, even how kind of a Bloomberg or Reuters or anything presents news now. And we have to address that. We can't continue to just present information in convoluted models, tech reports, press releases, whatever it may be. So as Bill mentioned, I'm involved with two companies. I'm chairman of a company called Integra Resources. So we started a new company and we bought an old asset from Kinross. That asset produced for 30 years, from the 70s to the 90s, and then for 20 years from the 1880s to the 1910. We're looking at using technology to go back, pull all that information together, and present it in such a way where any millennial, anybody can, through just their phone or a website, understand what the value proposition. And that's oversimplifying it. But the example I'll give is the other company that I'm involved with, called Verify Technology. What we're trying to do is create a platform where anybody can learn, can come in and within 5 minutes understand the value proposition of any specific company and what we do as an industry. We have an office. There's 12 of us in the office. 10 of those people do not have any mining experience. It's an office. It's how you'd picture a tech office. A week ago, I took a model for a company called Pure Gold, and it took me 2.5 minutes, and I timed it, to explain to everybody using a colorful 3D model that we could spin around and is very interactive, to explain the value proposition of this company. Here's the old shaft, here's the old workings. And at the end of it, 8 of the 10 people, we went around the room and asked, said when the next press release comes out, they're going to understand kind of the context or the value of those drill results and how they are in relation to the existing value proposition of that company. I think that's very powerful. And I think I'm a big believer on what Liam mentioned, that there is an untapped, that there are untapped investors out there, and if we can find ways to present our information to them, we're going to attract a lot of that capital back. Otherwise, what's going to happen is we'll continue the circle of looking for your traditional resource investors, which I believe, unless something changes, that's maybe a price of gold increase or resource increase or something else, will continue to shrink.
So just then, I'm going to work backwards this way, because when you think about, you were talking about the mining disruption competition, and you had 150 ideas. There's real opportunities to use technology to reshape the mining supply chain for the future in terms of attracting new ideas, new concepts, new companies into the space. So how do you think we as an industry need to articulate the fact that we're not that fossilizing, pounding the earth with the old technology from 40 years ago? And we see this in the oil and gas industry in the very same way. So how do we talk about technology in a way that gives comfort not only to policymakers, to politicians, to the general public, to investors? How do we change the narrative, besides platforms like Verify?
I think, not to oversimplify, I think the answer is we need success stories. We need to find kind of, here's where we use technology in an exploration setting and it led to a discovery, or here's how we changed kind of the amount of cyanide that was used, or how we reclaimed this mine site using technology. And I think if we can start to show that, and off the top of my head I can't think of what those examples might be. If we can start to show that and embrace technology, and then as an industry get together and kind of push forward that message that we are not dinosaurs, that there is technology, we are embracing technology, and here are examples of that success. I think on the back of that, we will be able to attract back investors. But until that point, I think we will, whether it's fair or not, we will get painted with that brush of it's an archaic industry that our parents used to invest in.
Fair enough. And George, your thoughts on that?
My thoughts go in a similar direction. I think mining companies are technology companies. They just don't market it properly. I've done a lot of work with automotive 6, 7, 8 years ago, and for quite a lot of period of time. They always viewed as the leading edge in terms of technology. But then you work with mining companies and you realize, well, actually, their IT organizations, they are as technologically advanced as these guys, but they are not viewed as such. So I think it's more like a perception thing that you can change using modern tools, what we have just seen with Verify in the back of the room.
Yeah, I think too it's communication. I subscribe to a lot of press releases, and your soul dies a little bit if you get another drilling update at 9 a.m. in the morning. The press release goes out at 4:35, and I get it before I get to work, and it's like 15 drilling updates. It's trying to communicate. So technology not only is operational, but it's also looking at how do you change like an annual general shareholders meeting? Do you start having virtual conferences? How do you broaden your stakeholders? I attend the Barrick AGM every year, and they always fly in. The activist shareholders are always flying in, and then you have to deal with the Q&A at this one setting and an in-person meeting. Why couldn't you do that virtually? That you try and get the stakeholders in and have a virtual conference. Also, you could look at having like virtual safety demonstrations. For example, the best man at my wedding he's a VP operations at Boeing, and he actually took me there and he showed me how they maintain and inspect plane wings. They had this interesting conundrum that you can't exactly get a big 3-ring bind of maintenance schedules up in your harness while you're inspecting a wing. So they do it with wearable technology. So they have basically a set of glasses they put in their eyes, and they can actually tap the side of the glasses to get the maintenance manual across their eye line, like it comes up visually. Then they inspect the wing, and then if someone at a different plant on the other side of the United States wants to inspect the same thing at the same time, they can communicate through an earpiece, look at the same piece of the wing, look at the same piece of the manual, and actually talk about it. And they're both suspended underneath this wing. And they actually put that on YouTube. So you can go on YouTube and they can see what Boeing does to inspect a wing. Like, mining doesn't do that. They kind of issue, right now, we think it's press releases. And how many people actually read press releases? Like, I get press releases from my clients, but I don't read all the press releases or news. Like, they have to find a different way of communicating and to connect and make sure that people see what they're doing, because we don't, as Stephen said, you don't see the same innovation mantra for mining. All you see is the same methodologies being used and the same communication being used.
Okay, so maybe we'll turn to the audience at this juncture and find out if there's any questions for the panel directly on. Yep, right in the back there, Anthony. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear the panel's view. Do you feel that the regulator, whether it's a mine site regulator or the public markets regulator, is, as far as the Canadian situation is concerned, is catching up or falling further behind when it comes to the implementation of technology into mining?
Maybe we'll start with Steve on this end and work down through Liam again.
I think if we do a good job communicating what we do, and this goes through in how we market to investors, but also how we market to communities and various stakeholders for all these companies, I personally believe you're going to see the role of the regulator shrink, because if everyone has transparent access to information, you'll never be a 100% self-regulated market, but in a transparent market, the role of the regulator gets to sit back a little bit and allow sort of a much more efficient regulation process naturally take place. So in that sense, I don't know if the regulators need to really catch up from a technological standpoint. I think they need to allow kind of communication, and even the way that we use press releases and everything else, allow that to evolve. The best example I can think of is, I believe, the SEC now allows American companies, they don't have to put press releases out across the wire. They can say, at this time, we will be posting our press release on this social medium, be it Facebook or whatever else it may be. And that is now viewed as full dissemination. I think those type of changes, if the regulators can continue to embrace that type of change and evolve as technology evolves, I think there's a real opportunity for how companies communicate.
George.
Yeah, not much to add actually. It's about transparency, and the analytical tools are there. The connectivity into what's happening in the mines is there. If you can make all of that transparent, then I guess the need for regulators will go down, or actually will become less.
Yeah, but I suppose if you look at most bureaucracies, if they're frightened of something, do slow things down. I'm a tax professional by trade. And in only very limited circumstances can we send an email to someone at the Canada Revenue Agency, because they don't trust that medium. So if you're dealing with agencies which can't quite get used to email, which has been around since I've started work in the mid-90s, they do tend to put brakes on things, same as how successful were the crowdfunders approaching the OSC. Like they struggled and they went there and they talked to them a lot about crowdfunding and regulation. Didn't get very far, and the crowdfunding phenomenon has died down a lot. I think 2 or 3 years ago, crowdfunding was going to be huge in Canada. Then they had a simple conundrum of how do you do a flow-through share through a crowdfunding brokered placement. They couldn't get their head around it, so it hasn't happened.
I'm touching on something you both mentioned earlier, which was bringing in the next generation of investor and also being able to get non-mining people to simply understand what a mining project is about. And one of my frustrations is I know how to read something on CDAR and the PEAs and that sort of thing and the resource statements, but I can't see how a retail investor could possibly get their head around the really complex numbers and put it into context. Do you think that either the regulators or the industry is going to go towards finding a way to simplify that in order to make the average investors, which really do push share prices, be able to understand technology and geoscience data in a more practical way?
Start with Steve, and then we'll work our way down to Liam.
That's a really good question. I think no. I don't think we need to change 43-101 or information on that sense. I think if you think of an efficient market or an open marketplace, I think what we need to do is allow people to come in and I'll give the best example I can think of is Reddit. Reddit, sort of the best news, the most trusted news, or kind of whatever's the most relevant is just voted to the top, and whatever's not considered relevant is voted to the bottom. I think if information is all presented in a standardized format, what you're going to start to see is thought leaders in the industry who can understand and are credible the same way we view analysts and others, but that's a very small group given the amount of investors that are out there. I think you'll start to see kind of the crowd mentality come in and start to filter through what is good and what is not. Going forward, I think kind of going back to the same thing, I think companies do need to find ways to present that information. The CDAR example is a great one. I think CDAR, SETI, all of these kind of archaic websites need to be brought up to date regardless. When it was about 3 months ago, I sat down with our team of developers, and I said, who can tell me kind of how many shares I own in Integra Resources? I'm an insider, it's public. Not one of them could get through SETI to figure that out, and these are people with technical backgrounds. That needs to change, but regardless. But should be a quick fix, which will probably happen in the next 30 years or so. But I do think that if we find a way to present information in sort of a standardized format, you will see, be it analysts or just technically capable people kind of start to push that news to the top and see the stuff that isn't as relevant or not as exciting to the bottom. One thing I'll add to that is one of the things we're trying to come up with right now are a set of principles to abide by. And exploration companies right now, it's sort of you're reliant on, well, we hit 10 grams over 13 meters, whatever it may be. Companies should be rated on different, whether it's exploration, development, or production. Maybe for exploration companies, it's how many meters are you drilling per dollar in G&A, whatever it may be. And I think if we start to organize in very simplified terms that any investor can understand, you would be able to present companies at value proposition and find a way to rank what's good and what's not.
George?
I tried to do an analogy with the manufacturing industry. Many of the manufacturers have come up with something like a factory tour to show people, everybody, how they come from the raw material to the final product. Why don't mining companies do the same? I'm not speaking about taking thousands of people down to an underground mine and show them where the blasting is happening. But with new technologies, they can show it from the in situ rock to the broken rock to the crusher to the processing plant, and tell everybody it takes whatever a ton to blast to get 10 grams of gold, and that will be processed into so many ounces of a gold bar. So if you make this visibility of a manufacturing process also for a mining company, I think that adds a lot to the credibility. So in a way, you take the lid off the mine.
Liam.
Yeah, I think it's probably more emphasis on the mining company. Like, it's hard to expect a regulator to do anything except regulate. It's kind of what they do. You take when the ESMA reporting happened last year, the first time the transparency reporting in Canada happened in May. NRCan wanted that information in XBLR format so it could be readable. When we met with NRCan, most companies simply just PDF'd it. So instead of having readable data, because what they wanted is data that they could use. People would go into the NRCan website, extract the data, and actually tell a story. But most mining companies are scared the life out of them, so apparently 92% of them just took their Word document that they typed out, PDF'd it, and then gave it to the government, because they just simply didn't want to give their data to anyone else because they thought someone would create the story. It was a bit of a missed opportunity because the mining companies could have created their own story with their own data, but they kind of decided to do the easy route, which is basically not comply with the law and just basically put just numbers on a sheet as if you wrote it in pencil. So that's where mining companies need to take more action on it, to actually explain the numbers, explain the story, and kind of take control of the narrative. Regulators can't do that. So a regulator had that simple request, give us readable data, and the companies didn't comply. There was no penalty for not doing it, they just didn't comply. The mining companies could have embraced it, created the story, and then started this whole dialogue about what they pay to government, because there's a big story there. They don't realise that the resource industry in Canada is the biggest contributor to tax revenue. You take Potash Corp represents about 23% of the GDP of Saskatchewan. They pay $1.3 billion. Like, if they stop paying tax to Saskatchewan, the government goes broke. You create a story around that. So it's critical. But mining companies have to embrace it. If they don't embrace it, the regulators aren't. Like, why is CEDA going to do much? They don't care. They just care that they just want the documents filed in that long list, and you can't find anything.
So just as we're here in the home stretch, I want to stitch a bunch of things together because it's been fascinating in terms of, we talked about the next generation of investors, but what about the next generation of mining industry employees who might have the view that, again, this is a fossilizing industry, I'm going to spend my time in technology or doing something else. So I'll ask this question fairly open-ended for you, allowed back into it, is should mining operators have sound social media strategies relative to communication, investor confidence, and what any particular ways of tackling that for a typical mining company who might say, we're more used to monitoring social media to see if our name shows up in a bad way than actually using a social media strategy to advance our business?
I think it's absolutely essential. You take, I was at PDAC this year listening to one of the keynote speakers, and I cringed in his first 15 minutes of his speech how he basically described his life as a 22-year-old flogging around the bush in the Yukon, and how hard it was, and there was flies everywhere, and I had to sleep on a wet sleeping bag, and I had to walk uphill twice, and all that kind of stuff. And you're thinking, I know he's trying to tell a story, but do you think anyone who's under 30 is going to be really enamoured with joining the mining industry, thinking they're going to flog around the bush? But when you look at what his story was, you can use social media to your advantage of twisting a good story around that, which is something different, but add in that technology, where you got to create the narrative. So mining companies haven't quite embraced creating the narrative, which involves all sources of media. It's coming back to what I mentioned earlier. Your narrative isn't through your investor relations group issuing press releases. It's through creating a narrative, creating a feed, and getting people who are under 40 to create that feed. Because if you don't go like for like, it's like me I had my daughter's 9-year-old party yesterday. I didn't talk to them much because I don't know how to talk to a 9-year-old, but a 9-year-old can talk to a 9-year-old. It's the same as getting a millennial talking to a millennial to try and create these strategies. There's no point the current generation trying to create their own social media strategy. They need, like Stephen mentioned, you have to surround yourself with people who understand the strategy to get the message out.
And George?
I think it's essential that companies use these kind of channels to present themselves in the public view differently. and again, specifically addressing those areas where traditionally the viewpoints are more on the negative side. They should highlight on what they do in terms of environment, what they do in terms of keeping people safe. You only read about the incidents. You never read about all the things that they do to avoid them. But, well, unfortunately, it's still not enough. Those kind of things shared in public media would also be very helpful to make a better public view of a mine company.
And finally, and if you don't, after you hear this panel, make it one of the breaks, chance to see the Verify technology at work. But final word on the panel goes to Steve, who's out to disrupt the whole web world and with some great thinking around how the industry can present itself.
I think social media in itself, given the size of a lot of companies and just the number of them, I think we have to be, we can't be naive to the fact that we're probably never, as the juniors, kind of say the sub $50 million companies, it's going to be difficult to get a big social media following. There's 1,200 of us, and it's just the reality to our existence. I definitely agree with Liam. I think I don't think there's any quick fix like a social media or kind of create a Facebook page or Instagram or anything like that. I think companies need to change the narrative, and even in the conversation, it's almost like we're condescending towards how kind of we embrace technology. I don't think that's true at all. I think that the industry does a great job of doing it, but we need to change the narrative and find better ways to explain that to our stakeholders, to our investors, whoever it may be. If we can change the narrative, I think the social media following as one example of a channel. I think there will be a lot of other channels that come our way as well. One example I'll give is at PDAC we put out a YouTube video called The Verify School of Mining Promotion. And we just wanted to have a conversation around sort of a lot of the things that are going to be said at PDAC, and it was kind of 2.5 minute video of one-liners that everyone's probably heard at every booth, kind of funny things that mining promoters say to pitch their stories. And within about 24 hours, we had, I don't know, it was 8,000 or 9,000 views on this, and it's sort of, we were able to start a conversation, and then even myself going out and kind of talking to investors about Integra Resources, every time I said open in depth, I had to catch myself. And we were able to start a conversation around that. And I think if we can as an industry, get more creative in the kind of the narrative and what we do, I think the value proposition that we communicate to our stakeholders and our shareholders will follow close behind. I don't believe that kind of any one social media or there is sort of a quick fix to anything that we do, but I think all those tools are going to be great to kind of create that emotional connection between what we do and investors. And if we can do that, be it kind of, as you mentioned, pictures of kind of the environmental work we're doing, the community work we're doing, other things like that, I think if we can start to create that narrative, we will see investors come back into the space.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Liam. Thank you, George. And thank you, Stephen. And so we're going to segue to our next presentation. Thanks.